We're going to take some calls now for John Lewis Gaddis as he gets set here on our set. But we'll start taking your calls now so we can see what kind of questions you may have for Professor Gaddis. By the way, here is the cover of his book, George F. Kennan, An American Life. And we're going to begin with Ramon in Laredo, Texas. Ramon, you're on BookTV on C-SPAN 2.
Hi.
Hi, Ramon. Please go ahead.
Yes, excellent book. There's a book by Lester Brown that's called State of the World. It happens every year, and he has a book called World on the Edge. And it really talks about sustainability and the Cold Wars that are going to come up in the future having to do with fresh water. Do you have any comments on the future of Cold Wars, on the survival of humanity as far as fresh water and food is concerned?
All right. Thank you, Ramon. And now joining us here next to the History and Biography tent is John Lewis Gaddis. He's almost ready to join us, and as soon as he does, we will ask him that question, Ramon. Alvaro in Flushing, New York, what's your question or comment about George Kennan and the Cold War?
Oh, thank you. My question is a little bit of a follow-up to the discussion about Russia. And as far as analyzing in the longer strategic and longer historical terms the U.S. unnecessary reaction to 9/11, but as far as any excesses, for example, the security state, the surveillance, that has increased every seems to be ever more in more degrees every time, and furthermore. Things like indefinite detention and whether does it see any dangers in the U.S. sliding off the democratic course in this regard, for example.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And I think Professor John Lewis Gaddis is now joining us here next to the History and Biography tent. Professor Gaddis, welcome to BookTV on C-SPAN 2.
Thanks so much.
We appreciate it. Now, we've taken two calls already, and I want to see if we can. You have any response for these callers?
Sure.
The first caller asked about Lester Brown and his books. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Les Brown's books or not, but he talked about some of the upcoming potential global wars, such as a war over fresh water.
Sure. Well, who can say that that is not a danger? And it seems to me that in some ways we have always had these kinds of risks out there, risks of war over natural resources of one kind or another. Are they getting greater at this point? Well, many people think they are because they think population is increasing exponentially. But actually, if you look at population trends in many parts of the world, the population has begun to, birth rates have begun to drop dramatically. So I'm not convinced that this is automatic, that there would be these kinds of wars. For that to happen, there really would have to be these huge growths in population. And it may be that modern technology operating in other ways is contributing to a decline in that, so one may offset the other.
How much, if any, of the Cold War was about natural resources?
Relatively little of the Cold War, it seems to me, was about natural resources. The Cold War really was about filling a power vacuum in Europe that was left by the defeat of Hitler. The Cold War was later about nuclear weapons and the means of deterrence. The Cold War was certainly about ideas. It was about ideologies, capitalism and democracy versus communism, command economies, all of that. To some extent, the Cold War was about personalities. If you think about the other Cold War that developed, which was the one between communist China and the Soviet Union, that was about personalities to a very considerable extent, Khrushchev and Mao. Natural resources, I don't think so, not so much. Possibly this will be different in the future, but I just don't think that was a major concern.
Now, the second question we took was about Russia, but it was also about historically 9/11 and the response to 9/11. I think you heard part of that.
I heard part of it, and the question was about surveillance particularly. And there's no question that levels of surveillance have grown enormously. And to some extent, that is connected with 9/11. But I would ask, I think a useful thing to do in studying history is always to drop out some dramatic event and just see if the trends would have continued anyway. So if you dropped out 9/11, if that had never happened, would surveillance be increasing still? I think it might be, because I think that is tied to the technological developments that are there. We can surveil. We can do it at increasingly ambitious levels. 9/11 may have accelerated the process, but I think that technology is probably irreversible, and we're going to be living with that kind of surveillance state for the foreseeable future.
George F. Kennan, An American Life, is the name of the book that John Lewis Gaddis, professor at Yale, was talking about a little bit earlier, if you saw his presentation. If not, very quickly, John Lewis Gaddis, what were George Kennan's official titles?
His titles were chiefly not very impressive, considering his reputation. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, ambassador to Yugoslavia, chairman of the first policy planning staff created in the State Department, never Secretary of State, never a political figure of any consequence. His role is in the role of ideas. The idea of containment as a way of avoiding the unpalatable extremes of war or appeasement after World War II. The critique of American foreign policy, and particularly of nuclear weapons during that period. The great histories that he wrote in the last half of his life. Titles, though, were not very important. I asked George once, what title would you like to be remembered by? And he said, teacher. And that sounds good to me.
What years active?
His years of activity are quite astonishing, because he lived to be 101. And he was active right up to the end.
But in U.S. government
service.
In
the U.S. government, much briefer. It's well, not that brief. He's a career Foreign Service officer for 25 years, from 1925 to 1950. He's ambassador in 1952, Soviet Union, gets kicked out. Is ambassador again in 61 to 63, Yugoslavia, but that doesn't go well either, so he resigns. And that's it as far as his government service is concerned. So everything else was done in the private sphere.
Next call for John Lewis Gaddis comes from James in College Park, Maryland. Hi, James.
Hi, Professor Gaddis. I'm looking forward to getting your book. I'm a big fan of George Kennan. Could you elaborate a little bit more on his insights and observations of Stalin's psychological makeup when he was in Russia during the Second World War?
Well, he was in Russia for the last 2 years of the war. He had been in Russia twice before that. He had probably as much exposure to Russia as any American did in that period. When he made observations about psychology, it was more often about the psychology of the leadership, and that, of course, was Stalin in that period. And the critical observation that he made was that however amicable the relationship with Stalin had been during the war, the period of the Big Three, that was expediency. There was no basis for a permanent, lasting relationship, because Stalin's psychology was one of trusting no one around him, and because Stalin was an absolute dictator, that distrust of everyone and everything was projected onto the behavior of the Soviet Union itself. So that is why he said we could never have a normal relationship with the Soviet Union.
George F. Kennan, An American Life, Pulitzer Prize winner for 2012 for Biography. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Next call, Kenneth in San Diego, California. Hi, Kenneth.
Hi. I'd like to ask whether Professor Kahneman, whether he's considered the application of Professor Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, the strategy thinking.
Actually, the answer is yes. I am thinking about that right now. Professor Kahneman's book came out after I had finished writing my book. But one of the things that I teach at Yale is strategy. And so we deal all the time with the question of whether it's better to have one big idea, to be a hedgehog in Isaiah Berlin's terminology, or to be a fox, to have a bunch of adaptable, flexible ideas. And I think one of the answers to that is that it's very important to be both, but it's important to know when to be which. And the Kahneman book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, actually offers some basis for thinking about that, because thinking slow is having a grand plan that you keep coming back to, a sense of direction in whatever you're doing. Thinking fast is adapting to the unexpected things that happen to you along the way. So yes, I do think it has relevance, but it's not something that I was able to bring in the Kennan book.
Which president was George F. Kennan closest to? To whom?
Curiously, he was closest to John F. Kennedy, by far.